There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from doing too much, but from holding too much. You carry it quietly. You smile when you are supposed to smile. You say you are fine when you are not fine. And somewhere underneath all of that careful composure, something is pressing against the walls. Something that has been waiting, perhaps for years, to be heard. That something is anger. And before you dismiss it, before you tell yourself that you are not an angry person, consider this. Anger is not always loud. It does not always arrive as a raised voice or a slammed door. Sometimes it arrives as a persistent tiredness, as a bitterness you cannot quite name, as a distance you keep from people who once felt close, as a sudden disproportionate reaction to something small, because the small thing was never really the point. The question worth sitting with is not whether you feel anger. The question is what that anger is protecting. There is a way of thinking about emotions that treats them not as problems to be solved, but as signals to be understood. Anger, in this framework, is one of the most intelligent signals the human psyche produces. It arises when something that matters to you has been violated, a boundary crossed, a need ignored, a truth silenced. It is the part of you that knows, even when the rest of you has been trained to forget, that something is not right. The difficulty is that many people were never given permission to feel their anger honestly. Perhaps you grew up in an environment where anger was dangerous, where expressing it led to punishment, withdrawal, or the kind of cold silence that felt worse than any argument. Perhaps you were taught, directly or indirectly, that your anger was too much, too dramatic, too selfish. Perhaps you learned that keeping the peace was more important than telling the truth, and so you adapted. You became skilled at swallowing what you felt. You became, in the eyes of others, easy to be around. But suppressed emotions do not disappear. They migrate. They find other forms. What begins as unexpressed anger can settle into the body as tension, as fatigue, as a low and persistent anxiety that you cannot trace to any single source. It can harden over time into resentment, that particular emotional weight that sits between anger and grief. That feeling of having given something and never been repaid, of having been wronged in a way that was never acknowledged. Resentment is often misunderstood as a moral failing, as evidence that a person is bitter or unforgiving. But one psychological lens suggests something different. Resentment is frequently the residue of unspoken hurt. It accumulates in the space between what happened and what was never allowed to be said about it. It is not a character flaw. It is a record. It is the emotional equivalent of a wound that was bandaged before it was cleaned. Think about the situations in which resentment tends to grow. It grows in relationships where one person consistently gives more than they receive, and where pointing that out feels too risky. It grows in families where certain truths are simply not spoken, where the unwritten rule is that we do not talk about that. It grows in workplaces where people are expected to absorb unreasonable demands without complaint, because complaining would mark them as difficult. In each of these situations, the anger that arises is entirely reasonable. What is unreasonable is the expectation that it should have nowhere to go. This is where the connection between anger and boundaries becomes important. A boundary is not a wall. It is not aggression or coldness. A boundary is simply a statement about what you need in order to remain whole, what you can offer and what you cannot, what you will accept and what you will not. Anger, at its most honest, is often the signal that a boundary has been crossed before you even had the language to name it. It is the body's way of saying, "This is not acceptable. This is not who I am. This is not what I agreed to." The problem is that many people were never taught to trust that signal. They were taught instead to question it, to wonder whether they were overreacting, to consider the other person's feelings so thoroughly that their own feelings became an afterthought. And so the anger turned inward. It became self-doubt. It became the quiet, corrosive belief that perhaps they were the problem after all. There is something philosophically significant in this pattern. Several thinkers across different traditions have observed that the self is not a fixed, unchanging thing. It is something that is constantly being shaped by experience, by relationship, by the stories we are told about who we are and what we deserve. When a person is consistently told, through words or through the behavior of others, that their feelings are inconvenient, their needs are excessive, and their anger is shameful, they begin to internalize that verdict. They begin to manage themselves on behalf of other people's comfort. And in doing so, they lose contact with something essential, the part of them that knows what they actually feel, what they actually need, and what they will no longer accept. Reclaiming that contact is not about becoming someone who expresses anger recklessly or without care. It is about something quieter and more fundamental. It is about allowing yourself to know what you feel before you decide what to do with it. It is about sitting with the anger long enough to ask what it is protecting. Because underneath almost every sustained anger, there is something more tender. There is a need that was not met, a love that was not returned in kind, a version of yourself that was not seen, a truth that was never given the space to be spoken. Sometimes the anger is protecting grief, the grief of a relationship that did not become what you hoped it would be, the grief of a childhood in which you had to be older than your years, the grief of having tried, genuinely and repeatedly, and still not being enough in someone else's eyes. Sometimes the anger is protecting a sense of self that was nearly lost. It is the last remaining signal that you still know the difference between what is right for you and what is not. In that sense, it is not a destructive force, it is a protective one. It is the part of you that refused to fully disappear, even when everything around you was asking it to. And sometimes the anger is protecting a question you have never been allowed to ask out loud. A question like, why was I never enough? Or, why did no one notice? Or, why did I have to carry this alone? These are not easy questions, but they are honest ones, and there is a kind of dignity in finally allowing yourself to ask them. Not to assign blame, not to reopen old wounds for the sake of it, but because you deserve to understand your own experience. Because the story of what happened to you is yours, and you are allowed to look at it clearly. If any of this feels familiar, the invitation is not to act on your anger immediately, or to confront everyone who has ever contributed to it. The invitation is simply to stop treating your anger as the enemy, to get curious about it rather than ashamed of it, to ask, gently and without judgment, what it has been carrying on your behalf, and what it might be trying to say if you finally gave it permission to speak. You do not have to perform calm, you do not feel. You do not have to be endlessly accommodating at the cost of your own truth, and you do not have to keep protecting other people from the reality of your experience. Your anger has been doing a great deal of work for a very long time. It deserves to be understood, not suppressed, and so do you. If this video opened something for you, take a moment with it before moving on. And if you would like to explore more of these quieter, deeper questions about how we feel and why, Inside the Labyrinth is here for exactly that. And if this spoke to a part of you that rarely gets heard, stay with that feeling for a moment. You are not broken because you feel deeply. You are only beginning to understand yourself. Subscribe to Inside the Labyrinth for more reflections on the hidden patterns of the human mind.